This is 2 Samuel chapter 17, starting at verse 1. Moreover, Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Let me choose 12,000 men, and I will arise and pursue David tonight. I will come upon him while he is weary and discouraged, and throw him into a panic, and all the people who are with him will flee. I will strike down only the king, and I will bring all the people back to you as a bride comes home to her husband. You seek the life of only one man, and all the people will be at peace." And the advice seemed right in the eyes of Absalom and all the elders of Israel. Then Absalom said, "Call Hushai the Archite also. Let us hear what he has to say." And when Hushai came to Absalom, Absalom said to him, "Thus has Ahithophel spoken. Shall we do as he says? If not, you speak." Then Hushai said to Absalom, "This time the counsel of Ahithophel is not good." Hushai said, "You know that your father and his men are mighty men, and that they are enraged like a bear robbed of her cubs in the field. Besides, your father is expert in war. He will not spend the night with the people. Behold, even now he has hidden himself in one of the pits or in some other place. And as soon as some of the people fall at the first attack, whoever hears it will say, 'There's been a slaughter among the people who follow Absalom.' Then even the valiant men, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will utterly melt with fear. For all Israel knows that your father is a mighty man, and that those who are with him are valiant men. My counsel is that all Israel be gathered to you from Dan to Beersheba as the sand by the sea for multitude, and that you go to battle in person. So we shall come upon him in some place where he is to be found, and we shall light upon him as the dew falls on the ground. And of him and all the men with him, not one will be left. If he withdraws into a city, then all Israel will bring ropes to that city, and we shall drag it into the valley until not even a pebble is to be found there." And Absalom and all the men of Israel said, "The counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel." For the Lord had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, so that the Lord might bring harm upon Absalom. Then Hushai said to Zadok and Abiathar the priests, "Thus and so did Ahithophel counsel Absalom and the elders of Israel, and thus and so have I counseled. Now, therefore, send quickly and tell David, 'Do not stay tonight at the fords of the wilderness, but by all means pass over, lest the king and all the people who are with him be swallowed up.'" Now Jonathan and Ahimaaz were waiting in En-Rogel. A female servant was to go and tell them, and they were to go and tell King David, for they were not to be seen entering the city. But a young man saw them and told Absalom. So both of them went away quickly and came to the house of a man at Bahurim, who had a well in his courtyard, and they went down into it. And the woman took and spread a covering over the well's mouth and scattered grain on it. Nothing was known of it. When Absalom's servants came to the woman at the house, they said, "Where is Ahimaaz and Jonathan?" And the woman said to them, "They have gone over the brook of water." When they had sought and could not find them, they returned to Jerusalem. After they had gone, the men came up out of the well and went and told King David. They said to David, "Arise and go quickly over the water, for thus and so has Ahithophel counseled against you." Then David arose and all the people who were with him, and they crossed the Jordan. By daybreak, not one was left who had not crossed the Jordan. When Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he saddled his donkey and went off home to his own city. He set his house in order and hanged himself, and he died, was buried in the tomb of his father. Then David came to Mahanaim, and Absalom crossed the Jordan with all the men of Israel. Now Absalom had set Amasa over the army instead of Joab. Amasa was the son of a man named Ithra the Ishmaelite, who had married Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, sister of Zeruiah, Joab's mother. And Israel and Absalom encamped in the land of Gilead. When David came to Mahanaim, Shobai, the son of Nahash, from Rabbah of the Ammonites, and Machir, the son of Amiel, from Lodabar, and Barzillai, the Gileadite, from Rogelim, brought beds, basins, and earthen vessels, wheat, barley, flour, parched grain, beans, and lentils, honey and curds, and sheep and cheese from the herd, for David and the people with him to eat. For they said, "The people are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness." Church, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In biblical theology, we talk about a doctrine that we call common grace. And common grace is what we name the good things that we find God giving to all of his creation, not just on those who are part of his covenant people, the church. Hospitals, for instance, they're often founded by Christian denominations or organizations, but not always. Large donations are made by non-believing people to help with natural disasters and other causes of pain and suffering in the world. Neighbors shovel driveways for the elderly. These graces we call common because God, in his goodness, even towards those who don't recognize him in life, uses them to bring good in a world full of evil. That's common grace. But the other category of grace is what we call special grace. And the difference can be boiled down to their scope of impact. Common grace is given in one sense to keep a fallen world from falling even further. But its benefits don't reach beyond this life here and now. Special grace is given only to the elect, to God's chosen people who are in Christ. So in special grace, the Christian is given grace for what lies beyond this life. And that great difference comes with knowing God. The recipient of common grace only doesn't know their Creator. But the one who receives special grace does know his Creator, and so considers his life, his decisions, his actions, and words in light of the Creator he knows. Why am I bringing up common grace and special grace in this passage? Because we want to talk about wisdom this morning. And it's an interesting thing when we consider that wisdom is something the Bible presents as given by God. If you are wise, it's because of God. But there's different kinds of wisdom, isn't there? There seems to be a worldly kind of wisdom. A worldly wisdom that gives good ideas and good plans for worldly and temporary goals. Are there wise people in the world who don't know Christ? Yes. Under common grace, God has given many people the skill and the ability to create wonderful medical advancements and incredible inventions and things that they've done without even knowing their Creator personally. But beyond that, in the world, there are men and women who get up early to exercise before going to work. That's a wise thing, right? There are people who live within their means and save for the future. That's a wise thing. World leaders who avoid and solve international crises apart from the God that they don't know. Wisdom can be found in the world, but it only has a certain reach. It has limitations. It's the common grace of their Creator that enables them to do what they can do. So in the first century, the Apostle Paul would use the worldly language of a Cretan poet to say this about God. In him we live and move and have our being. Paul hijacks this pagan poem to talk about the one true God. That everything that is good, as James says, comes down from the Father of lights. God, in his grace towards a fallen creation, bestows good things like even wisdom and advancements in technology and health and in all sorts of considerations to show his goodness. But the problem with the wisdom that's found in the world is not in whether it's practically beneficial. It often is. It's not even that it's always evil, because many times it's not. But we need to see the difference between worldly wisdom and godly wisdom. And it's significant enough that we want to be sure about which kind of wisdom we live by. What I hope we'll see about this story this morning, involving Absalom and Ahithophel, Hushai, the priests' sons, and even a couple in their house hiding a couple boys in a well, is that worldly wisdom doesn't consider God in decision making. But godly wisdom considers God in all decision making. And we can outline the story like this. First, we're going to see Absalom particularly looking for wisdom in verses 1 to 14. Then we'll see some people acting on that wisdom, namely Hushai and a couple of their sons of the priests in verses 15 to 23. And then lastly, in verses 24 to 29, we'll see the results of wisdom. So that's kind of our trajectory this morning as we think about worldly wisdom and godly wisdom. That outline is available in your bulletin if it's of help to you. Now we pick up the story in the middle of a conversation that began last week with the end of chapter 16. And you can really tell that sometimes the chapter breaks in the Bible are very uninspired, aren't they? Because at the end of chapter 16, we have the beginning of this conversation with Ahithophel and Hushai and Absalom, and then it ends, and then we go to chapter 17, and he says, moreover. So there's this connecting word right here that says we need to put these two things together. Now, for some background, if you're forgetting, our main character, David, has been self-exiled from Jerusalem. He's the rightful king, but he's fleeing his son Absalom, who has become the pretender to the throne. We've seen David encounter several different people on his long trek downhill to the River Jordan, running away from Absalom. And maybe most importantly, it was this man named Hushai the Archite. David tells him to return to the city and gives him a task of a double agent. That as he's there, he is to listen in on what Absalom's plans might be and report them through a network to get back to David and his people. And this was in fact in response to something that David prayed in chapter 15. As he was on his exile, his route to the River Jordan, David prayed to the Lord that he would turn the counsel of Ahithophel to foolishness. And it was then, right after that prayer, that Hushai appears. Now, Ahithophel was first David's advisor, and he was assisting Absalom in this royal coup, and Ahithophel's wisdom was David's biggest problem. Ahithophel was smart. Ahithophel knew David. He knew the kind of ways that David thought and how David might act. So as Absalom is acting out this coup and taking over the kingdom of Israel, David knows that his biggest problem isn't Absalom directly. It's actually who Absalom's listening to, the wise advisor Ahithophel. So he prays, we need to do something about Ahithophel. And God's answer to that prayer isn't that he just snaps his fingers and makes Ahithophel into an idiot who doesn't know right from wrong. Instead, he sends Hushai to David. David gives him this task. Now, Absalom, as we come back to verse 1 of chapter 17, is looking for wisdom. And what kind of wisdom is he looking for? Godly wisdom or worldly wisdom? Hushai and Ahithophel are set head to head in these first 14 verses. Ahithophel represents worldly wisdom. So in verses 1 through 4, he lays out the rest of his plan. He's already said, here's what you need to do in chapter 16 to make sure everybody knows how you feel about David, your father. To draw a clear line between yours and his kingdom and say everything is different now. Now, in light of that message that he's given to the people, now Absalom is being advised by Ahithophel to take out his biggest problem, which is David. Absalom is listening to this worldly wisdom from Ahithophel, who basically says, I'm going to take 12,000 men. We're going to go out and find David while he's tired, while he's weary, while he's depressed over what's going on. And we'll take David out by himself. We'll bring all the people back to you. He even uses this flowery language of, as a bride comes home to her husband. And what Ahithophel gives him is actually a very wise plan. It's a good plan. It will probably work. David's probably traveling with around 2,000 people. 12,000 men from Israel would be more than enough to overwhelm him. Wisdom shows up here for the obvious point of bringing enough resources. But secondly, it's also wise to say, let's strike David while he's weary and discouraged. And we know from chapter 16 that David is very weary and discouraged. But Ahithophel also says, we will only kill David and bring back everyone else in peace. So verse 4 of chapter 17, the advice seemed right in the eyes of Absalom and all the elders of Israel. So they heard Ahithophel, they heard his wisdom, They got the plan, and they saw that it made sense. So what happens then? Absalom has a plan. It's going to work. They can do it right now. But Absalom takes a second, and this is where, we kind of should scratch our heads a little bit here. From a worldly perspective, Absalom should have just said, yep, let's do what Ahithophel says, and he would have made his plans work out just perfectly. Excuse me. But instead, Absalom has this moment where he says, wouldn't it be good to hear an alternate perspective on all of this? Wouldn't it be good for us to hear what somebody like Hushai the Archite has to say? Now, if you remember when Hushai showed up, Absalom saw him and he was like, hold on a second. You are like one of my dad's best friends. What are you doing here? You should be out with him, shouldn't you? And Hushai convinced him. He said, hey, I'm going to serve the Lord wherever I am, and why shouldn't I serve you? So, in all that flattery that Hushai has already done by saying, hey, clearly you're who God's chosen. Clearly you're the king. I'm here to serve you. Absalom has received Hushai, and now he's ready to hear from him, which is ultimately going to be his downfall. Remember, Hushai is acting as a double agent. So, of course, his aim is to deceive Absalom and save David. Now, there are a few key things that stand out in this long advice that he gives to Absalom here. In verses 8 through 10, first, Hushai tells Absalom what's wrong with Ahithophel's plan. And again, this is where flattery comes in at the beginning in verse 8. Because here he says to Absalom, you know that your father and his men are mighty men and they're enraged. First, he starts with what Absalom knows. It's almost as if he's saying, you're asking people for advice. You already know what to do. You know enough about David. Don't forget who you are. You're Absalom. You know what to expect here. And flattery goes a long way with Absalom. You'll remember that Absalom thought very highly of himself and his political ability a few chapters ago and his beautiful hair. He knows that David is a warrior who's never been captured before. He knows that his father David is an expert in war. But the emphasis is on the fact that Ahithophel said one thing, but Absalom knows better. See, Hushai recognizes the pride in Absalom's heart. And he recognizes that in Ahithophel's plan, it didn't involve Absalom. Ahithophel said, you stay here, I'll go kill David. And that was, I think, where Hushai says, that's my loophole, right in there. I'm going to sneak in here and basically just say, don't you want to be a part of this, Absalom? Isn't this your job? Aren't you the king? Don't you know better? See, worldly wisdom, of course, is what is offered to us to accomplish our own personal plans. And yes, Hushai is representing godly wisdom here. We'll get to that in a second. But first, we want to see why this is so appealing to Absalom. Why does he believe Hushai's plan more than Ahithophel's? Well, let's go on. In verse 11, he says, hey, instead of just getting 12,000 men, why don't we gather all of your forces from Dan to Beersheba? He's basically saying the whole nation. Let's get all the soldiers that we can. And he says, you go, you bring them in all the glory of your wonderful armies, in your great battle expertise. You go head to head against David and show him who the real king is. He says, if you do what Ahithophel does, or what Ahithophel is suggesting here, then David is going to be the one who sneaks up on you. You think you're going to catch him by surprise? He's going to catch you by surprise. So Hushai's plan works. Absalom receives it. He says in verse 14, Absalom and all the men of Israel said, it's almost like an exact copy of verse 4. It's just about Hushai's advice. The counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel. For the Lord had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel so that the Lord might bring harm upon Absalom. Absalom was looking for a way to bring harm on his dad, and he wanted to be a part of that. He wanted the kind of wisdom that was going to help him enact all of his worldly and limited perspective, all of his plans, all of his hopes to get what he wants in this life. But Hushai's advice comes in not as a better plan than Ahithophel's. It's actually worse. The only way you're going to get David is by surprise, if you can happen to surprise him. Ahithophel's plan is right. It's better than Hushai's. What's the difference here? It's in verse 14, the second part, the second sentence. For, or because, the Lord had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel. That was David's prayer. Turn Ahithophel's counsel to foolishness. And the Lord ordained to do so. And then he gives us a why. So that the Lord might bring harm upon Absalom. Absalom was looking for worldly wisdom to accomplish his goal. But worldly wisdom will never overcome God's wisdom. Nothing that this world can do will overcome what God has ordained and set in place to happen. Do you believe that, church? Even for as wise as those in the world can be, Ahithophel had a good plan as far as what Absalom wanted to do. But God intervenes and allows Hushai to appeal to Absalom's pride, even. And this is what is mysterious about the will of God. He often allows the sin of humanity to bring about his ultimate plan. It's mysterious, isn't it? Doesn't it make us wonder, does that mean that God creates evil and sin in order to do what he wants to do? Certainly not. In fact, it is in one sense a kindness that God gives to his creation to say, okay, look, if you want to go ahead and go this route, then do it. But it won't affect what I'm striving for and working towards here and now. It won't affect what my plans that I've ordained are going to bring about. Excuse me. So God uses Hushai's words to stoke pride in Absalom's heart and lead him to reject the good counsel of Ahithophel because God's plan is going to supersede Absalom's. See, Absalom's biggest problem isn't that he chose the wrong counsel. It was the kind of counsel that he was looking for. Because he had a worldly plan, that was, kill my dad. I mean, that's just almost always going to be a worldly plan, isn't it? If that's your plan, you're almost always in sin in that. But because that was his plan, he was looking for worldly kind of wisdom. And worldly wisdom can include tactful, thought-out plans, like Ahithophel offered to Absalom. Hushai really just doubled down on what Absalom wanted, and he went for it. The weakness of worldly wisdom is just in what distinguishes worldly from godly wisdom. It's the acknowledgement of who God is. Worldly wisdom disregards God entirely. Godly wisdom says there is a God who is over all that I need to consider. In fact, just about a year ago, we were in 1 Timothy and talking about godliness. And so Bible scholar R. Kent Hughes defined godliness in this way. It is the revelation of the duty man owes to God in terms of both believing and living rightly. And so if we take that definition of godliness and put it into the context of wisdom and say, well, what is godly wisdom? It is that insight that helps us both believe and live rightly before God, recognizing we have a duty to him, that we owe our lives to him as our creator, and certainly in Christ we owe our lives to him as our Savior. So godly wisdom involves us realizing that our desires, our plans, and our actions are all before the God who made us, and that he requires us to pursue wisdom in line with faith in him and right living. So I'd ask you again, loved ones, what kind of wisdom would you say you've been looking for lately in your life? Worldly wisdom or godly? A wisdom that acknowledges who the Creator is, what he's done for you, and what you owe to him? Or a wisdom that acknowledges what you're looking for and what you would like to accomplish? Let's see how these characters then act on wisdom in verse 15. Hushai wastes no time after this conversation. He goes to the priests. David had sent them back to Jerusalem, gives them a message for David. It's just simply get moving. You have a little window. You have an opportunity. Hushai doesn't know for sure which plan Absalom's going to go with. But if he goes with Hushai's plan, then David has an opportunity to escape. So that message is sent by a female servant to Jonathan and Ahimaaz, who would run it to David in the wilderness. Now, this is where things get really exciting. And again, somebody needs to make this into some kind of cinematic event, either a TV miniseries or a big movie. But the two boys are on their way to deliver this message, and they realize that the duty they owe to God in believing and living rightly before him is going to bring them to some danger, some possible struggles and challenges. Because serving God, living out of godly wisdom, means being a friend of God's king, like we talked about last week. And that can be dangerous. But the Lord got the message through. Worldly wisdom would have probably recommended some other team to do this. Worldly wisdom would have said, I told you they'd be found out. But by the time we get to verses 21 and 22, we see that the message got through to David and they got everyone safely to the other side of the Jordan River. But in between there, Jonathan and Ahimaaz end up at the bottom of a well, which is kind of funny if you think about it. Hiding in a well may not have been on the boys' minds when they were thinking through their mission. But in God's wisdom, he provided a hiding place for them. God's wisdom prevailed from Hushai's deception all the way to the runners carrying the message to David. But they had to land in a well first. Now, you would think that Absalom's servants who took the time to stop and talk to the woman of the house would also have looked around a little bit, right? You would think that the well would be a natural hiding place and they would have investigated it at the top of their list. But the servants believed the woman's word and the boys were safe in this dried out well. Godly wisdom was given to these boys in a surprising way. You can imagine them sitting silently in the bottom of the well, maybe hearing the conversation. Where did they go? What did they say? All those kinds of things. And they're sitting there silently, hoping that they don't get found out. You can imagine them praying, Lord, don't let them find us. Godly wisdom is found in those who are willing to end up in these kinds of places. What looks like a dead end in the eyes of worldly wisdom is actually a refuge in the Lord when we follow godly wisdom. So, church, don't assume that you're outside of God's will when all you can do in a situation is pray and trust him. Remember that definition of godliness. It is the revelation of the duty man owes to God in terms of both believing and living rightly. You can live and believe rightly in the bottom of a well. Godly wisdom might lead you there someday. Hopefully not literally. But sometimes life can feel like the bottom of a dried up well, right? Godly wisdom straightens out our thinking. It restores us to believing and living rightly. That is trusting God in places like the bottom of a well. So acting on godly wisdom provides faith to jump in the well in the first place. 2, in David's case, to cross the river as fast as you can when you're already exhausted. To see in all of life that there's a God who's orchestrating all events of your life and calls you to simply trust and obey him. That is godly wisdom. What will it result in? Verse 23 gives us a plain, factual, and yet tragic end, not for the godly wise, but for the worldly wise. I don't think my PowerPoint's working, Kevin. Can you move me forward? Just one slide. Thank you, sir. When Ahithophel saw his counsel was not followed, he saddled his donkey and went off home to his own city. He set his house in order and hanged himself. And he died and was buried in the tomb of his father. For all the godly wisdom that we just saw enacted in that middle portion of the passage, it's painful then to come back to this to read about David's advisor, his trusted friend. He was probably a great source of godly wisdom when he was serving David. Why would he bring himself to this kind of an end? Well, 2 things. First, the author is clear about the cause. Look at verse 23 again. It says, when Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, that was the cause that brought him to his death. It may seem at first to suggest that he was just disappointed that Absalom didn't use his idea. That maybe he felt like he had been outed from his position, that he had nothing left. No, that's not it at all. Remember, Ahithophel knows David very well. In reality, he knew that Hushai's plan would only let David get further away from Absalom and give him the time he needed to strengthen his forces and come back and take Jerusalem. Absalom certainly saw what was going on. Ahithophel. There's too many characters in this. Ahithophel saw what was going on at this point. And tragically, he made an assumption on that. He left the city, went home, got everything in order, and ended his own life. What was the assumption that he made? David is coming back, and when he finds me, I'm a dead man. Now, rather than putting himself at the mercy of God's chosen king, he took matters into his own hands. He decided to be the master of his own fate. And this is the ultimate end of worldly wisdom: utter disregard for the Creator. See, Ahithophel knew David. He knew his mercy towards Saul, towards Abner, and others that were his enemies. Over and over, David was merciful to those who betrayed him. It may be that Ahithophel doesn't think that David will be merciful this time, that the betrayal is too deep. Or it may have been that Ahithophel didn't want David's mercy. Or maybe it was both. Maybe he didn't know if he would get mercy from David, but he also didn't want it if it was offered. Worldly wisdom's biggest problem is that it disregards the Creator. It disregards the character of God, and in this case, the character of God's chosen king. See, when we get to the end of this whole battle with Absalom and David's forces, and David comes back to the kingdom, spoiler alert, he's going to be king again. When he comes back, one of the first things he does is pardon many of his enemies. And really, when we come to that part of the chapter, there's almost going to be like this empty space where we say, well, isn't this where he should have pardoned Ahithophel? But Ahithophel has taken himself out of the picture entirely. Either because he didn't think he would get mercy, or because he didn't want it. Either way, it's a terrible, tragic end to this advisor to the king. So do you see, loved ones, how this kind of wisdom is the opposite of godly wisdom? Instead of acknowledging and looking to God, it disregards him and even rejects good that would come from him. The enemies of God, apart from their hearts being changed, always choose death over God's kindness. This should make us think of another friend of a king turned traitor. Anyone coming to your mind? Listening to worldly wisdom? Thinking he could become rich by selling out great David's greater son? This is in so many ways an eerie foreshadowing of Judas Iscariot, isn't it? Who had the same kind of end. But what about David? Verses 24 to 26 show us that we're on the precipice of battle between David and Absalom. It's about to happen. David comes to Mahanaim, where Saul's last son, Ishbosheth, was headquartered. This was during his rebellious reign. Do you remember? As soon as David had become king, Ishbosheth was put up to be a rival king, and he's out of the picture entirely now. But this is that place. And surprisingly, in that place of opposition, David ends up finding more friends in unexpected places. And they bring this abundant feast for David's company. Now, some commentators wonder if this is where the idea for Psalm 23 verse 5 came from, where David writes in that psalm that we all know, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." Church, this is the result of godly wisdom. Nourishment, rest, refreshment, unexpected kindness. The one who acknowledges God, not spurning him, but trusting his mercy and his grace, that one will not be disappointed ultimately. And that's ultimately what Hushai and the priests, the boys in the well, and David teach us about godly wisdom. It's a wisdom that sees God's plans can't be undone by worldly wisdom and acts on their knowing God. This is a challenge for God's people in a world where godly wisdom calls us to obedience to the gospel, the good news about what Christ has done. And that in obedience to the gospel, we're also to proclaim that gospel. And we proclaim it to a people who all they have is worldly wisdom. Just look at 1 Corinthians 1, starting at verse 18. The word of the cross, Paul says, is folly or foolishness to those who are perishing. Now, those who are perishing are those who have worldly wisdom. They have a limited scope that only pertains to this life. And so they are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. What is the power of God? Back to the beginning. The word of the cross. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. It's talking about worldly wisdom again there. It will not stand before divine wisdom and divine sovereignty. So then Paul writes, where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where's the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. Now, if that's not a back and forth kind of statement that keeps your head spinning, I don't know what is. What he's saying here, well, we'll get to it in a second. Let's just keep reading. Verse 22. For Jews demand signs, and Greeks seek wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly or foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. Church, there's only one kind of wisdom that leads to the power of God. God has made worldly wisdom foolish. Through what? Through the foolishness of the cross of Christ. To some, it's a stumbling block. It's not what they asked for. It's not what they want. To others, it's foolishness. All their own worldly wisdom repels them from it, looking for something greater, greater than a crucified king. So what is the difference between these who reject and those who receive the good news? Is it that you, if you've received the gospel, that you're wiser on your own for choosing Christ? No. Everything in David's life has hung on one sovereign truth, one overarching theology of God's choosing David and keeping him. And it's no different in your life either. You're not a fugitive king, at least I don't think any of you are. But it's to those who, like King David, are called. We're called to friendship with Christ Jesus, the crucified and risen Lord over all things. He who is both the wisdom and the power of God. He's the one who calls us to himself, to have godly wisdom, seeing how to believe and live rightly before him. He's the one who calls the man of war to retreat, the friend of the true king to return to enemy territory, the messengers to hide in a well. Greater than these things, though, was his own call to the cross, to win by losing, to give life by dying, to defeat evil by becoming sin and taking the full wrath of God upon himself for those that he would call to godly wisdom. Loved ones, we are foolish if we think that we live perfectly godly lives, aren't we? If all our decisions and plans are always made with God's rule in mind, if we think that's the case. If we think that we always make our decisions with the cross of Christ in view. But that's what godly wisdom calls us to considering our Maker, our Savior in all of life, in every avenue, submitting everything to him, not to our own worldly wisdom. Today, as we prepare to share in communion with the Lord and with each other, I'd invite you to consider the ways ungodly or worldly wisdom has influenced your own plans, how it's turned you away from the mercy and goodness of your God for some temporary pleasure or security or distraction even. When you think about a corner of life that you see, a corner of your life rather, that you see godly wisdom is desperately needed, because we all have those things, don't we? Know that Christ has provided it for us in himself. And will you yield that to our wise King and trust him with all aspects of your life?